The sealed queen. You are a Roman guard outside a sealed chamber in Alexandria. Yet the real prison is not built of stone. Rome has locked Cleopatra away for one reason, not to kill her, but to break her. You have stood watch for so many nights that the torch smoke has soaked into your cloak and hair, turning you into part of the corridor itself. The palace of Alexandria is still alive. Distant footsteps, murmured Latin orders, the scrape of sandals over marble, but this passage feels separate from the living world. Here, the air is colder, the walls are thicker, the silence is intentional. In front of you is a sealed stone chamber with a single guarded door, and behind it sits the most dangerous captive you have ever been told to protect from death. Cleopatra, the seventh queen of Egypt, Pharaoh by decree, descendant of the Ptolemies, the woman Rome has argued about for years, as if she were a storm on the horizon, is alone in there. No court, no priests, no musicians, no incense, no public prayers to Isis, only stone, a small ration delivered at fixed hours, and the knowledge that every breath she takes is allowed by Roman command. When the night is quiet enough, you hear movement, soft footsteps on hard floor, the faint rustle of linen, sometimes a voice speaking into the darkness, as if another person stands near her. But you know what the order said. She is alone. She must remain alone. A week has passed since her capture, 7 days in which the corridor has been guarded as if it held a weapon that might still detonate. You tell yourself she cannot harm you. She is locked away. And yet your hand keeps finding the hilt of your sword whenever her footsteps pause too long, as if she has found a seam in the world. The men in command do not speak of it openly, but everyone feels it. This is not normal imprisonment. When Rome captures kings, it does not hide them like contraband. Rome drags them into the light, forces them to kneel, forces them to become proof. But Cleopatra is not being displayed. She is being contained like a fever, like an infection, like something that might spread through eyes and words. You remember the first day, August 1st, 30 before Christ, because it smelled like blood and wet stone. They said Mark Antony was dying inside the tomb she built for herself, a fortress of stone near the temple of Isis. Some swore they saw it with their own eyes. Antony below, bleeding out, men begging Cleopatra to open the doors, her refusal sharp as iron, then ropes lowering from above, the Queen of Egypt hauling her dying lover upward through a high opening, because opening the main door would mean capture. You imagine it in spite of yourself, the blood smearing the stone as he is dragged inside, the death of a Roman giant occurring not in a battlefield, but in a chamber built for a queen's final act. Then came Octavian's message, polite, almost gentle. He wished to discuss terms. He wished to speak of her children. Even you, a guard, understood what that meant. A promise is a blade when delivered at the right moment. While Cleopatra spoke through a narrow gap, soldiers climbed the outer wall, entered through the same opening used to pull Antony inside, and the trap closed. You heard later she reached for a dagger hidden in her clothing, that she fought like a woman who knew the shape of humiliation, that she screamed a vow, "You will not take me alive to Rome," and that the men had orders more terrifying than any threat. Keep her alive. It is easy to imagine killing an enemy. It is harder to imagine guarding her life against her own will, holding her body in the world because someone else needs her breathing. The first time you heard those orders, you assumed it was greed. Octavian wanted treasure, names, the location of hidden gold, the keys to Egyptian vaults. But the palace now belongs to Rome. The treasury can be forced open. The scribes can be beaten. Gold is not the reason she is still alive. The reason is worse, because it is Reframing. You have heard veterans talk about triumphs in Rome, the great parades where captured kings walk in chains, their children beside them, their faces turned into public instruction. The crowd does not just witness victory, it consumes it. It learns with laughter and spittle what happens to those who challenge the Republic. And Cleopatra knows this. She knows what it means to be marched through Roman streets as a living trophy before being executed or thrown into a cell to die slowly, forgotten and unspoken. She is not merely afraid of death. She is afraid of being rewritten. Yet strangely, Octavian has not paraded her. He has not announced her capture with the triumphal certainty you would expect. He has sealed her in a chamber and let time do something that swords cannot. During your shifts, you sometimes see the physician sent by Octavian. He does not look like an executioner. That is why he is more frightening. He carries small instruments, sealed vials, dry cloths. He is there to keep her alive if she tries to starve herself, if she tries to bleed herself, if she tries to poison herself with the smallest hidden bite of metal or plant. You watch him go in and out under escort, and you notice the pattern. He never stays long enough to be mercy. He stays only long enough to preserve function. At first, Cleopatra tried the direct path. That much everyone whispers. She refused food, refused water, turned her face from the rations, as if she could starve her way out of Rome's plan. The result was immediate. The physician entered. Guards entered. Hands entered. She was forced to drink. Forced to swallow. Forced back into the role Octavian demanded. Living evidence. Living property. And that is when the real method began. Not a whip, not a blade, but a schedule. Every day is measured. Every ration delivered at the same time. Every interruption calculated. The torches outside her door do not burn down into darkness. They are replaced before the corridor ever becomes truly night. Sleep is allowed, but never fully. Quiet is allowed, but never complete. The guards change shifts with deliberate noise, boots louder than necessary, Latin spoken just beyond the door. Not cruelty in the way barbarians practice it, but cruelty refined into administration. An empire does not have to scream. It can ruin you with routine. You begin to notice, over days, that Cleopatra's movements change. In the first nights she paced quickly, as if her mind still believed there was a way to force the world to obey her. Now her steps are slower, measured, as if she is rationing not food, but hope. Sometimes she stands still for so long, you wonder if she has collapsed. Then you hear fabric shift, a breath, a single footstep, a reminder that she is still under Rome's control. The men around you talk more freely than they should. They say Octavian visits the palace and does not go to her door, not yet. They say he is waiting for the right moment, because Cleopatra is a story Rome must tell carefully. A civil war between Romans is ugly. Rome cannot celebrate it cleanly. But a war against an Eastern queen, a foreign seductress, a witch, a corruption, can be sold like sacred duty. Cleopatra, alive and articulate, is dangerous to that story. She could stand in Rome and speak. She could remind senators and citizens that she negotiated with Roman leaders, that she once lived among them, that she is not a monster from the edge of the map. She is too real. Complicated enemies are difficult to turn into symbols. So the symbol must be made inside this sealed chamber, not by killing her, but by reshaping her until she fits the mask Rome wants to parade. That understanding creeps into you one night as you listen to her voice through stone. She is speaking again, softly, as if addressing someone. At first you assume prayer. Then you recognize a pattern not Egyptian, not Greek, but the cadence of someone rehearsing. She is speaking like a ruler preparing words for an audience, testing a speech against the air. A prisoner can live in a cell, but a queen lives in an imagined courtroom. Even alone, Cleopatra is building her case. Your throat tightens because you realize Octavian's problem is not simply that she might die. His problem is that she might survive with her mind intact. And that is why the chamber is sealed, why she is isolated, why the light never fully dies, why the silence is never truly clean. Rome is not guarding her body from assassination. Rome is attacking the last thing it cannot chain, a narrative inside her head. The corridor shifts with footsteps, multiple, deliberate, heavier than a routine patrol. A centurion approaches with two men you do not recognize, and with them comes a different smell: polished leather, fresh oil, the faint bitterness of ink. Not soldiers alone, officials, the kind of men who keep records. The centurion gives you a look that means do not speak unless spoken to. Then he turns to the sealed door, signals, and the lock mechanisms begin to move. Your pulse quickens because you understand what this means. 7 days were only preparation. The breaking is about to become personal. As the door opens, a thin slice of air escapes from the chamber, stale, dry, human. And then you hear her footsteps approach from inside, slow and controlled, like a woman choosing exactly how to be seen. The officials step forward, and you realize, with a cold certainty, that Octavian is no longer waiting for Cleopatra to surrender. He is ready to offer her something far more dangerous than violence: a choice. And Rome's choices always come with invisible chains. Cliffhanger. The door is fully open now, and the first man inside does not carry a sword. He carries a document, a seal, and the power to decide which version of Cleopatra the world will be allowed to remember. The lie of mercy was offered not as salvation, but as a test. Rome did not ask Cleopatra to surrender her kingdom. It asked her to surrender herself. The men who entered the chamber did not look like executioners. That was the first cruelty. Their tunics were clean, their hands empty of weapons, their posture measured and calm. One carried a wooden tablet sealed with wax. Another carried nothing at all, which somehow made him the most dangerous. Cleopatra stood before them in plain linen, no crown, no jewelry, her hair unbound. For the first time since her capture, she was being seen not as a body to be guarded, but as a subject to be negotiated. The tablet was opened slowly, deliberately, as if the pace itself were part of the message. The terms were spoken in controlled Latin, then repeated in Greek, so there could be no misunderstanding. Caesar Octavian, victorious and magnanimous, wished to ensure order. Egypt would be secured. Cleopatra's children would be protected. She herself would be treated with dignity, so long as she cooperated. The word cooperated lingered in the chamber like smoke. Cleopatra listened without interruption. Her face revealed nothing, but inside her mind, the structure of the trap was already forming. Rome never began with threats when it wanted obedience. It began with promises just generous enough to feel real. Protection for her children was not mercy. It was leverage. Dignity was not a guarantee. It was conditional behavior. She asked a single question: would she remain queen? The answer came smoothly. Titles would be discussed later. For now, peace was the priority. That was when Cleopatra understood that Rome was not negotiating an end. It was negotiating a transformation. She was no longer being treated as a ruler who had lost a war. She was being reduced to a variable in Octavian's larger design. Her identity itself was being put on trial. After the officials left, the chamber was sealed again. But something fundamental had changed. The isolation no longer felt like containment. It felt like preparation. From that moment on, the pattern intensified. Information arrived in fragments carefully selected, carefully timed. News that some of her allies had defected. News that others had already sworn loyalty to Rome. News that the people of Alexandria were calm, orderly, accepting the new reality with unsettling ease. Each piece was delivered as if it were reassurance. In truth, it was erosion. Cleopatra was allowed writing materials, but only certain ones. Papyrus, yes. Ink, yes. Messengers, no. Every word she wrote would be read before it went anywhere. She could draft letters to Octavian, but not send them. She could record her thoughts, but only into a silence that would not answer back. A queen who had ruled through language was now permitted speech only as rehearsal. Sleep became unreliable, not through violence, but through interruption. Guards changed shifts at irregular hours. Torches were replaced before they dimmed, denying the chamber true night. When she closed her eyes, time lost its edges. Days blended. Hunger came and went without meaning. This was not negligence. It was calibration. She tried another form of resistance composure. She bathed when permitted. She stood straight. She spoke politely. She refused to beg. For a while, it seemed to unsettle them. The guards watched her closely. The officials paused before speaking, as if recalculating. But Rome was patient. When dignity failed to produce desperation, Rome shifted tactics. One evening, an officer mentioned casually that Octavian planned a great triumph in Rome. Nothing specific. Just a remark, almost conversational. Cleopatra did not respond, but the image struck her with surgical precision. Herself in chains, her children behind her, the crowd shouting as history crystallized into mockery. The next morning, she was told again casually that triumphs could be adjusted, that some captives were spared the worst of them. The message was clear. Her future was flexible. Her cooperation would determine the shape of her humiliation. That night, she finally wept, not loudly, not theatrically, but silently, with the restraint of someone who understands that emotion itself is being observed. Rome wanted her fear, but not yet. First, it wanted uncertainty. Fear would come later. Outside the sealed chamber, the guards noticed the change. Cleopatra no longer paced. She sat for long stretches, unmoving, staring at nothing. When she spoke, it was less often, and when she did, it was precise, measured, as if every word were being tested against an unseen scale. Octavian had not visited her. He did not need to. His presence was already complete, and somewhere in the palace, preparations were being made not for her death, but for the moment she would finally understand that survival itself had become the punishment. Cliffhanger. The next morning, the physician arrived with someone new, not a healer, not a guard, but a man whose job was to ask questions that had no safe answers. The ritual of breaking Rome did not break rulers with chains or blades. It broke them by teaching them that resistance itself was meaningless. The man who entered the chamber wore no uniform. That absence was deliberate. He was older, his hair already thinning, his movements slow and unthreatening. He carried nothing in his hands, not even a tablet. To the guards, he looked harmless. To Cleopatra, he was instantly recognizable for what he truly was, a listener trained by Rome. He did not begin with questions. He began with observation. He looked at the chamber, at the walls, at the light, at her posture. Only then did his eyes meet hers. When he spoke, his voice was low and conversational, as if they were equals sharing a private moment rather than enemies separated by conquest. He told her he had been asked to ensure her well-being, not her comfort, her well-being. The distinction mattered. He spoke of Rome's respect for intelligence, for culture, for continuity. He mentioned Alexandria's libraries, Egypt's long memory, the sacred authority of ancient kings. None of it was accidental. He was mapping the shape of her pride, tracing where pressure might be applied without leaving marks. Then he began the ritual. He asked her to explain herself, not her actions in the war, not her alliances, but her identity. Who was Cleopatra, truly? A queen chosen by gods, or a ruler sustained by circumstance? A mother protecting her children, or a strategist who had gambled with their future? Each question was framed gently, but each one forced her to choose between competing truths. Rome did not need her answers to be wrong. It needed them to conflict. When she asserted her legitimacy as Pharaoh, he acknowledged it, then reminded her that Egypt now answered to Rome. When she spoke of love for her people, he noted calmly that Alexandria had not risen for her. When she spoke of Antony, he referred to him as a Ramang who had lost his way. Every belief she presented was accepted, then hollowed. This was not interrogation. It was inversion. Hours passed without measure. Food arrived, but conversation did not stop. The listener never raised his voice. He never threatened. He never accused. He simply reframed. By the time he left, Cleopatra felt something she had never experienced before, not fear of death, but doubt about meaning. Rome was not arguing that she was wrong. It was arguing that none of it mattered anymore. That night, she dreamed of her coronation not as it had been, but as Rome would tell it. She stood in ceremonial dress while unseen voices narrated her story incorrectly, confidently, and to an audience that believed every word. She woke with the realization that memory itself could be conquered. The next days followed the same pattern. The listener returned, sometimes alone, sometimes with the physician. Sometimes they spoke of her children, how adaptable young minds were, how easily loyalties shifted when guided early. Sometimes they spoke of Rome's mercy toward those who accepted reality, never directly, always as implication. Cleopatra attempted resistance through silence. The response was immediate. The chamber grew louder. Guards spoke openly outside her door. Names were mentioned, dates, plans. She was excluded from knowledge, just enough to feel irrelevant. Silence was punished not with pain, but with erasure. She began to speak again. The ritual's true power lay in repetition. Each conversation circled the same themes from different angles: inevitability, adaptation, survival. Rome did not demand submission. It offered reinterpretation. She could still be remembered if she allowed Rome to define how. One evening, the listener asked a final question before leaving. Did she believe history was written by gods or by men? Cleopatra answered without hesitation, by men. He smiled not kindly, but with satisfaction. Then he reminded her that men could be negotiated with. Gods could not. When he left, the chamber felt smaller than it ever had. The walls had not moved, but her sense of distance from the world had collapsed. For the first time, she considered a future in which her choices no longer belonged to her, that they existed only as reactions within a structure she could not escape. Outside, the guards noticed she no longer looked at the door when it opened. She looked past it, as if already imagining a world where it no longer mattered. Octavian's method was working, not because Cleopatra was weak, but because Rome understood something ancient and cruel. A ruler can endure suffering, but a ruler who loses control over her own story has already been defeated. Cliffhanger. The following morning, a sealed message arrived from Octavian himself, and for the first time, it did not offer survival, but a form of honor that required a final decision. The woman Rome could not parade. Rome could not humiliate Cleopatra in public. She was too composed, too aware. So it decided to defeat her where no audience could intervene, inside her sense of self. The message from Octavian arrived at dawn, sealed with authority and restraint. It was not read aloud by an official. It was placed in Cleopatra's hands, as if acknowledging one last time that she was still capable of comprehension, still worthy of direct address. The language was careful, almost respectful. Octavian spoke of order, of stability, of the future Rome intended to bring to Egypt. He spoke of her children again, emphasizing their safety with the calm certainty of someone who already controlled the outcome. Then came the offer. Cleopatra would not be dragged through Rome in chains like other defeated rulers. There would be no public stripping of dignity, no theatrical cruelty. Instead, she would be allowed to present herself as a cooperative queen who had recognized Rome's inevitability. Her image would be managed. Her death, when it came, would be framed as noble, controlled, even admirable. History, Octavian suggested, could still remember her with a degree of grace. The implication was unmistakable. This was not mercy. It was narrative control. Cleopatra read the message twice, and folded it with deliberate precision. Rome had finally revealed its true objective. It did not merely want her gone. It wanted her simplified, reduced to a symbol safe enough to display. The Eastern queen who accepted defeat. The foreign ruler who acknowledged Roman superiority. A woman whose end confirmed Rome's moral authority rather than challenging it. That was why she could not be paraded. A woman who spoke as Cleopatra spoke would disrupt the spectacle. She would look too human, too articulate, too familiar. The crowd might hesitate. Senators might remember negotiations, dinners, shared histories. The triumph would fracture. Rome could not afford ambiguity. So the solution was to ensure that when Cleopatra died, she did so within a story Rome had already finished writing. The pressure increased subtly after that. The listener returned, but his tone had shifted. He spoke now of acceptance rather than adaptation, of peace rather than survival. He asked fewer questions and offered more conclusions. Cleopatra noticed that the chamber itself had changed. The light was softer, the guards quieter. Comfort was being introduced, not as kindness, but as incentive. She resisted in the only way left to her, by thinking. She replayed every conversation, every promise, every omission. Rome's strategy was now clear. Octavian did not need her alive forever. He needed her to arrive at a specific psychological state one, in which death appeared not as defeat, but as agency. A queen choosing her end was far more useful than a prisoner executed by command. Choice would absolve Rome. Consent would sanitize conquest. That realization shocked her more deeply than the capture itself. Rome was attempting to weaponize her pride. She tested the boundaries. She asked about her children directly, where they were, who guarded them. The answers were vague, but confident. She asked about Egypt's administration. She was told plans were underway. Each response was designed to reassure without empowering. She was being kept informed just enough to feel involved, but never enough to influence outcomes. At night, she felt the weight of isolation differently now. The silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like invitation. Rome wanted her to sit alone with her thoughts until the conclusion seemed inevitable, until choosing death felt like reclaiming control. But Cleopatra understood something Octavian underestimated. She had ruled in a world of gods, omens, and symbolic acts. She knew that how a ruler dies becomes part of how they rule forever. Rome wanted a clean ending. She could still complicate it. Her composure unsettled them. When she accepted food calmly, when she spoke without desperation, when she acknowledged the offer without reacting, the officials recalibrated. They had expected anger or bargaining. Instead, they found calculation. Cleopatra was not breaking. She was preparing. Outside the chamber, the guards sensed the shift. Orders were whispered. Watch rotations tightened. The physician lingered longer. Whatever Rome feared now, it feared her resolve more than her resistance. By the end of the day, Cleopatra understood the final shape of the trap. She was being guided toward a moment where Rome would step back and allow her to act confident that whatever she chose would serve their version of history. The next move would be decisive. Cliffhanger. That night, Cleopatra requested a private audience, not to negotiate, but to declare her readiness for Rome's final terms. The death that was allowed Cleopatra did not choose death in desperation. She was guided toward it until it became the only act Rome could no longer control. Her request for a private audience unsettled the palace more than any outburst could have. Cleopatra had not begged, threatened, or pleaded. She had asked calmly, formally, as a ruler accustomed to being heard. That alone disrupted Octavian's design. Desperation was predictable. Composure was dangerous. The audience was not granted in person. Octavian did not intend to risk proximity. Instead, intermediaries arrived, senior officials, men with practiced restraint, men trained to listen for weakness and deliver certainty in return. Cleopatra stood as they entered, her posture deliberate, her face composed beyond what captivity should have allowed. She did not speak first. They informed her that Rome was prepared to finalize arrangements. Her children would be sent away from Egypt, raised under Roman supervision. Their futures would be secure so long as she ensured stability in the present. Her own fate would be dignified, private, and controlled. Rome would not display her suffering. History would remember her as a queen who understood inevitability. Cleopatra listened. Then she surprised them. She accepted. Not immediately, but completely. She did not ask for revisions. She did not seek clarification. She did not bargain for symbols or ceremonies. Her agreement was so thorough it felt rehearsed. The officials exchanged glances. This was not how surrender was supposed to sound. That night, the atmosphere shifted again. Guards were instructed to loosen their vigilance slightly. The chamber felt less like a cell and more like a waiting room. Cleopatra was allowed personal items, cosmetics, garments, writing materials. Not freedom, but preparation. Rome was confident now. It believed the conclusion had been reached. But Cleopatra had reached a different understanding. She knew Rome's greatest fear was not her death, it was her refusal to play the role assigned to her. By accepting their terms outwardly, she gained a narrow margin of inward autonomy. Rome believed it had guided her to consent. In truth, it had given her the illusion of trust. She used it carefully. She wrote letters not pleas, but records. Not for Rome, but for time. She organized her thoughts, ordered her memories, preserved names and intentions in a way Rome could not fully intercept. She bathed and dressed as a queen, not for ceremony, but for clarity. If this was to be the final act, it would be performed consciously. The physician returned more frequently now. He asked gentle questions. He examined her pulse, her eyes, her breathing. He was there to ensure she remained alive, but also to ensure she did not die prematurely. Cleopatra noticed what he avoided saying. Certain methods were never discussed. Certain materials were never mentioned. Rome did not want unpredictability. That, too, was a weakness. Cleopatra understood that whatever end came next would not be impulsive. It would be allowed, controlled, sanitized. Rome wanted a death that fit its narrative, one that looked voluntary, restrained, almost poetic. A queen choosing dignity over disgrace. A story that absolved conquest. But Rome could not fully script timing. As the days narrowed, Cleopatra felt the strange calm that comes when fear exhausts itself. The rituals of breaking had failed to destroy her will. They had only sharpened her awareness. She no longer imagined escape. She imagined consequence. How would this moment echo? What silence would it leave behind? On the final morning, the guards noticed her demeanor change. She spoke less. She moved with intention. When food was delivered, she thanked them. When the door was sealed, she stood quietly in the center of the chamber, as if measuring its dimensions one last time. Rome believed the decision was already made. But what Cleopatra intended was not submission. It was interruption. She would not die as Rome's simplified symbol. She would die in a way that forced questions, subtle ones, deniable ones, but persistent. A death that appeared clean on the surface, yet resisted certainty beneath it. Rome wanted closure. She would give it ambiguity. As evening approached, a final inspection was ordered. The guards prepared to enter, confident that the long operation was complete. They did not know that Cleopatra had already moved beyond the terms offered to her, and that the death Rome believed it controlled was about to escape its grasp. Cliffhanger. When the chamber was opened for the last time, Cleopatra was alive, but the room held signs that something irreversible had already begun. The lie history needed history remembers a peaceful death, because peace is easier to teach than truth. What happened inside that chamber was Rome's final lesson in how power erases its enemies. It was not the stillness of sleep or the quiet of resignation. It was the absence of tension, as if something essential had already departed. Cleopatra lay composed, her body arranged with care, her garments unmarked, her face calm in a way that unsettled the men who entered. There were no visible wounds, no spilled blood, no sign of struggle. Rome's version of events seemed to present itself perfectly. too perfectly. The physician stepped forward first, trained eyes scanning for chaos that was not there. Breath was shallow, then gone. Life had ended, but not violently, not publicly, exactly as Rome had planned. And yet, unease moved through the room, because control had slipped in ways that could not be easily named. There was no asp to be found. No snake, no basket. No dramatic instrument of death, waiting to be displayed. That story would come later crafted, repeated, polished. What existed in the chamber was ambiguity. And ambiguity terrified Rome more than rebellion. Octavian was informed immediately. His response was measured, almost restrained. He did not celebrate. He did not rage. He ordered the chamber sealed again, and the witnesses limited. The fewer eyes, the fewer questions. Cleopatra's body would be prepared. The narrative would be finalized. Rome did not need the truth. It needed a version of events that could survive repetition. Within days, the story hardened. Cleopatra, proud and unyielding, had chosen death over humiliation. A noble end, a queen's decision. The empire could respect that. Rome had not killed her. It had merely witnessed her choice. Responsibility dissolved into myth. But the men who stood guard knew something was missing. They had watched the process unfold. They had seen the isolation, the manipulation, the calculated erosion of certainty. They had seen how choice itself had been engineered, how every path except one had been quietly removed. Cleopatra's death was called voluntary, because Rome had mastered the art of narrowing freedom until surrender felt like agency. That is how empires avoid guilt. Cleopatra's children were taken from Egypt, their futures reshaped far from her legacy. Egypt itself was absorbed, its wealth redirected, its identity rewritten under Roman administration. The last pharaoh became a footnote, her complexity flattened into a cautionary tale about excess and seduction. Rome needed her to be a warning, not a mirror, and so the lie endured. Centuries later, poets would romanticize the asp. Artists would paint a beautiful queen dying serenely, untouched by fear. The brutality of psychological conquest would be replaced with symbolism, because symbols are easier to admire than methods. History prefers endings that feel clean. But the truth remained buried in fragments ancient writers hinting at delays, at supervision, at prevention. Records that spoke not of suicide alone, but of control, of time taken, of a death that occurred only after Rome was satisfied. Cleopatra was not defeated on the day she died. She was defeated over 10 days of silence, routine, isolation, and carefully rationed hope. Her final act was not weakness. It was resistance within constraint, a refusal to become the spectacle Rome desired. That is why her death still unsettles, because it reveals something uncomfortable about power. Not that it kills, but that it convinces. Not that it conquers bodies, but that it colonizes meaning. Rome did not merely end Cleopatra's life. It ended her ability to tell her own story. And that is the most effective kind of victory. When you hear the myth of the asp, remember this. Empires rarely leave fingerprints. They leave narratives. And the most horrifying part of Cleopatra's final days is not how she died, but how carefully the world was taught to misunderstand why. The chamber was sealed. The story was written. And history, once again, obeyed power.